Good morning, ladies. I hope you've had a great week and are looking forward to a wonderful weekend. So today it's kind of fun to think about good luck charms. Don't know if you have a favorite good luck charm. So let's think of some good luck charms that maybe we all have used from time to time. One that I think is really, really common is knocking on wood. I know that you know that knocking on wood does nothing to make something happen, but we do it all the time. There are things like rabbit's foot, the wishing on a star. There's so many things that people use as a good luck charm, and they're really kind of superstitious about it. I know athletes are very famous for their little routines that they have before a game, or the clothing they wear. I hear that there are athletes that, will not wear anything but this one pair of socks. I also heard that Michael Jordan wore, when he became a professional basketball player, wore his University of North Carolina Tar Heel basketball shorts from his years there in college, and continued to wear them throughout his NBA career. As a matter of fact, the thought is that maybe that's why the NBA lengthened the shorts down to the knees, so it would disguise the fact that he had on a pair of UNC shorts underneath. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what I hear. So there are a lot of things that the athletes do, but I think that normal people like us who are not professional athletes in any way, that there are things that we incorporate into our routine that are little superstitions, and we kind of chuckle about it and laugh about it, and I don't think it's all that harmful until we maybe turn it into something that is attached to God in some way, attached to our faith. And that's what we're going to be looking at in our lesson today. Now, I want to read to you a quote from a psychologist named Stuart Weiss. He's a PhD, and he is the author of a book entitled Believing in Magic, The Psychology of Superstition. He tells Yahoo Health that superstitions are more common than we think. Some polls have found that over 50% of Americans consider themselves at least a little bit superstitious. And he goes on to say that many people believe in superstitions because life is uncertain. When we really want something to happen, yet we can't make it happen for certain, we grasp for things that seem unlikely. And he says that superstitions often offer a feeling of control in situations where control is not possible. So, that really reveals something about us. We want to be in control of our circumstances. And we want it so badly that we'll even throw in a little bit of magic or superstition into our religion for for good measure. The habit is so ingrained in us that we have to be super intentional to remove it from our thinking. I think about how a lot of people, and I'm not really talking to you guys in terms of where you are in your walk with God, because I think that you and I have moved past this, but a lot of people see God as a good luck charm. Okay? I mean, you need to cover all your bases. So let's make sure we're on good terms with God, because, he's a good idea. I mean, God can be very beneficial to your life. And so we kind of put him in one of the categories in our life just to make sure we have his help when we need him. And so we can call on him kind of like you would call on a rabbit's foot, carrying around a rabbit's foot in your pocket. Even maybe a little wooden cross that you might put in your pocket, or any number of things that where we might just take God for granted as a covenant God, a relationship with him, and just see him as a good luck charm. Someone called it rabbit's foot religion or rabbit's foot theology. So the heart attitude that we're considering today is our controlling hearts. I think that's probably pretty natural and humanly speaking, that we would want to control our situations. And the irony of it is that we really have no control because God has it all. He is sovereign over the universe, which includes you and me. And so we really don't have control. We're not saying that we're supposed to just sit around and do nothing, and because it's all up to God. No, we are given responsibilities, and we are to, as Ephesians 2 says, we were created for good works. So in no way am I suggesting that, but we do need to understand that there is such a limit to what we can control in our lives. Being responsible, yes, that's good, but when all is said and done, we are not in control. God is in control of everything, even some of the most minute details of my life. I just am in awe and wonder sometimes about how God reaches into the details of my life and maneuvers things according to his will and according to his plan for my life. So, one of the things I want to say about my own personal experience with this is, over the years, I've been learning this truth that God is in control and that I am not, and that I do not need to have a controlling heart. But I thought I was doing really, really well with this until last December, late afternoon on the 21st in Franklin, North Carolina, when a little baby girl named Bonnie Noel decided to come into the world without being at the hospital. Our daughter Victoria's, the hospital had sent her home saying she was not far enough along in her labor, that she needed to go home, which she did. And God controlled the situation. I mean, just down to every little detail. And so I learned very, very, with shaky, trembling awe, I learned that God was in control. Again, when we were at the hospital for John's triple bypass in January, just a month later, I again learned that God is in control of all of these things that I have absolutely, especially when you're in the hospital, you have no control over anything. And I'm sitting there with my dear friend Sue Webster in the waiting room after John, I had waved and kissed him, and he was off to surgery. And so about an hour later, Sue and I are sitting in the waiting room off the surgical ward, and the surgeon comes to us and says, "Well, we're going to stop." And I said, "You're what?" And he said, "We aren't going to go any further. There's just not a good vibes happening in the operating room, and we're going to stop." And that was all the explanation that he could give me. And I was so befuddled and shocked by that. I was really close to losing it. And my sweet friend Sue and I, after the doctor walked away, we just sat and prayed and just could not understand. And, honestly, I still don't understand to this day everything that was going on and in the mind of this surgeon. I know some facts about it, but it just, I've talked to so many people that are very shocked by my experience, our experience, because that's not something that happens routinely. Surgeons don't stop an hour into preparation for them to do their thing. It's a very, very rare and remarkable thing. And so God was in control, and God stopped that surgery. The surgeon didn't do it. God stopped it. He was definitely in control. So I'm learning, after many, many years of walking with God, I am learning that to the extent that He is in control is pretty mind-boggling. So let's look at our story today in 1 Samuel and look at the controlling hearts of these Israelites. Now, Israel went out to battle against the Philistines. Did I say I'm in chapter 4? 1 Samuel chapter 4. Israel went out to battle against the Philistines. They encamped at Ebenezer, and the Philistines encamped at Aphek. The Philistines drew up in line against Israel, and when the battle spread, Israel was defeated before the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men on the battlefield. So the Philistines killed 4,000 of the Israelites. And when the people came to the camp, the elders of Israel said, "Why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord here from Shiloh, that it may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies." So the people sent to Shiloh and brought from there the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. So let's just set this up here and make sure we all know who the Philistines were. They originated from a small island, the small island of Crete in the Mediterranean, and had become a huge military force since the time of Abraham. It was one of the 5 people groups that God had commanded first Moses and then Joshua to eradicate from the promised land of Canaan when they arrived there 40 years after the exodus from Egypt. Evidently, God's people had become complacent and lazy during the time period of Joshua's military leadership and laid down their weapons to build homes for their families. And it's understandable. My family wants a home. We're here to put down roots. So let's deal with the enemy later. Now, the book of Joshua is not only a history of this time period, but it's also a picture of the spiritual battles that we must faithfully fight against the enemy and the sins that want to destroy us. Just like the Israelites and their desire for a comfortable life without any battles, we too desire a comfortable life. We don't want to fight. But God says we must be obedient to His commands and fight the good fight with the spiritual weapons that He has provided for us. You can see that in Ephesians 6, where He tells us how we're to fight this unseen enemy, the principalities in the high places that war against our souls. And so the Israelites had lost the battle. Okay, that's the reason for the whole next book after Joshua is Judges, which is our last book before where we are here in 1 Samuel. And the entire book of Judges is just one situation after another where God sends a judge to confront His people because of their disobedience. They had just completely fallen into a state of repeated sin. And so going back to our story today, verse 4 makes very clear who the Israelites are blaming for their defeat against the Philistines. They're saying clearly that it's God's fault. And you know what? When you think about the sovereignty of God, they're right. God is absolutely sovereignly controlling the outcome of this battle. He's allowing them to be beaten by the very people he told them to destroy earlier, and they disobeyed. But shouldn't they, in this situation that we're looking at in chapter 4, shouldn't they have then just stopped and contemplated what was happening, confessed their sins to the God who brought them this defeat? Well, that's what they should have done, but that is not what they did. So the conclusion that these Jewish elders came to in this defeat was, actually, it's almost comical if it wasn't so pathetic. They decided to bring the ark. They have ignored the God that the ark represents, but they see this ark as a symbol of God's presence and the good luck charm that they need for defeating the Philistines at long last. They clearly say this in verse 3. It will save us. They believed they could force God to fight for them for the sake of his own reputation. Do you realize that maybe we tend to do this? Oh God, yeah, you really need to answer this prayer or people are not going to believe in you. I mean, can we manipulate God like that? Can he be manhandled? But that's what they're doing. They are seeing God and this ark that represents God, they're seeing him as the good luck charm that they need. Now, the Ark of the Covenant, let me just briefly remind you what the Ark of the Covenant is. It's from Exodus 25, and you can go to Exodus 25 and read 10 through 22 for a description of the ark. It was the only piece of furniture in the most holy place, and in the contents of the ark, the most important thing that we know about are the Ten Commandments. The book of Hebrews also tells us that it contained a golden urn holding the manna that from the wilderness and Aaron's staff. But it was not to be touched by human hands. 2 wooden poles, also coated in gold, were used to transport it, and they were not to be removed from the ark. It had a mercy seat as a cover, a solid gold slab that fit perfectly on top, and it was hammered out from one piece of gold with 2 cherubim, angels, that had their wings overstretched over the mercy seat with faces that looked downward in reverent awe. So it was a very important symbol of the presence of God. And it's called the Ark of the Covenant. So covenant means relationship. So it was huge in that it was also not just a symbol of God, but a symbol of God's relationship with his people. Very, very important part of the at the time, tabernacle, and later the temple. So I mentioned put in the notes, if you looked at the notes that were sent out earlier in the week, a link to the synopsis of the movie, The Raiders of the Lost Ark. I don't know how many of you saw it back in the 80s. It's depicting a time period in the 30s, 1936, actually, when the idea of this archaeologist is going to go on a search for the Holy Grail, for the Ark of the Covenant. You know, that's just the way archaeologists think. And in the story, there's a a line in there, I'm not quoting it exactly, but where it's believed that Hitler himself was convinced that the Nazis needed the Ark of the Covenant and that they were going to be the possessors of the Ark of the Covenant, which isn't that ironic? The man who hated the Jews wanted the Jewish symbol of the presence of God. And that he believed that this iconic symbol of God would make him invincible, and that any army that carried this particular item into battle would defeat all of their enemies. And I mean, they thought that with good reason, because that is exactly what happened often when God would direct Moses and later Joshua to go into battle. Oftentimes they went forward at God's direction with the priests and Levites carrying this Ark of the Covenant with them before the army, and it would remain there until the battle was won. So it's just an interesting thing to me, though, that God has never allowed this item to be found. You know, we're looking at something that's like 3,000 years old, maybe more, and that, as far as anybody knows, it's never been destroyed. So where is it? Well, God doesn't want us to find it, and He is in control of that. And I think the reason He doesn't want us to find it is because we would turn it into an idol. That is just what mankind tends to do, because we want things that we can touch and see. And yet God says, no, it is not to be used that way. So He has it hidden somewhere. I guess He's still got it hidden, or it may not even exist anymore. I don't know. But back to our story today. The elders didn't have any authority to move the ark, to even touch it at all. So it was always in the custody, according to Scripture, it was always in the custody of the priests and the Levites. But here's the rub. Who were the priests and the Levites at this time? Well, you got it. Good old Eli and his sons Hophni and Phinehas. And where were they hiding out during the battle? Well, presumably at the temple, but they're happy to take part in this big show of strength by leading the parade, bring the ark from the Holy of Holies into battle. Now, there's no evidence that Eli or his sons had prayed and asked for God's guidance when the elders suggested bringing the ark into battle. They appear to be absent both physically and spiritually from the battle, but very willing to be part in the show. What we have here is the Israelites being in a position of needing to get right with God, turning to Him in faith to help them. But instead, they turn to a symbol of God rather than to God Himself. It's sacred in that the ark is sacred in that it represents God's presence and power, but it's really just a piece of furniture. So again, it's like using a good luck charm as the basis and the foundation of your theology. So they call for the ark instead of for the God of the ark and of the nation. They have simply added superstition to their sin of disobedience. Here's a quote from Spurgeon that I find very, very... Oh, never mind. I'll use that later. And I think that adding insult to God is ironic that Hophni and Phinehas are carrying the golden box that contains the 10 Commandments that they have so often scorned and despised by their flagrant sins. They have scorned the sacrifices. They have flagrantly sinned against the very commandments that they are proudly carrying in that golden box. It's very, very, it's no wonder God is going to just really clean house with them this day because of the flagrant sins. Jeremiah 7 says, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel." This is verse 3. "Amend your ways and your deeds, and I will let you dwell in this place. Do not trust in these deceptive words. This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. For if you truly amend your ways and your deeds, if you truly execute justice for one another," and he goes on and lists all of these different things that they had been doing wrong. He says, "Then I will let you dwell in this place, in the land that I gave of old to your fathers forever." And so this passage is interesting because he mentions this. It's almost like a magical chant. This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. And it's evidently, from what I was able to discover from the commentaries, it was something, just a rote chant that the people would say that was kind of trying to get God on their side. But what God wants from us is obedience, not religious incantations. So let's move on to the passage and see what happens next. "As soon as the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel gave a mighty shout, so that the earth resounded. And when the Philistines heard the noise of the shouting, they said, 'What does this great shouting in the camp of the Hebrews mean?' And when they learned that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid, for they said, 'A god has come into the camp.' And they said, 'Woe to us, for nothing like this has happened before. Woe to us, who can deliver us from the power of these mighty gods? These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with every sort of plague in the wilderness. Take courage and be men, O Philistines, lest you become slaves to the Hebrews, as they have been to you. Be men and fight.' So the Philistines fought." Now let me just stop right here. Apparently the Philistines had been watching the international news media, and they knew that they were in trouble if the ark was being brought into the battlefield. They knew the stories of how God had won great victories for Israel in the past. But what they didn't know was that there was no power in this box without the God that it represented. God wasn't in the box, and God wasn't in Israel's camp. He was absent because of the repeated and unconfessed sins of Israel. So Israel finds out who's really in control, and it wasn't them. We read on. The Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated, and they fled every man to his home. And there was a very great slaughter, for 30,000 foot soldiers of Israel fell. And the ark of God was captured, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. You know, the Israelites are finding out or experiencing what Paul spoke about in 2 Timothy 3, verse 5. The Israelites had a form of godliness, but they denied its power. In other words, not denied as in said it was untrue, but they acted. What they acted out revealed that they didn't believe in godliness. They did not appropriate the power that was available to them if they went to God. They went to the box instead of going to God. It's a fulfillment of the prophetic judgment that's found in chapter 2. I don't know if you remember this, but back in chapter 2 of 1 Samuel, you wouldn't remember it from a previous lesson because we didn't read it. But if you turn back to chapter 2, a stranger had appeared at Eli's door as a result of the sins of Hophni and Phinehas and their desecration of the sacrifices, as well as their very blatant and public sexual activities on the steps of the tabernacle. And he spoke this judgment to Eli. And I'm not reading the whole thing, starting at verse 33. The only one of you, speaking about Eli's family, whom I shall not cut off from the altar, shall be spared to weep his eyes out and to grieve his heart. And all the descendants of your house shall die by the sword of men. And this that shall come upon your 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, shall be assigned to you. Both of them shall die on the same day. Wow. This is a fulfillment of this previous, earlier, probably even maybe 7+ years earlier, when this man had appeared at the door of Eli. We know from chapter 3, this was last week's lesson, that God spoke a similar prophecy against Eli and his family into the ears of young Samuel, who was only about 12 years old. And so the prophecy has been given to Eli directly, both by the man that showed up at his door, and again later to through the young prophet Samuel. So here we've got the fulfillment of this prophecy, the actual historical time that it happened. Verse 12, continuing in chapter 4, a man of Benjamin ran from the battle line and came to Shiloh the same day with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. When he arrived, Eli was sitting on his seat by the road watching, for his heart trembled for the ark of God. And when the man came into the city and told the news, all the city cried out. When Eli heard the sound of the outcry, he said, "What is this uproar?" Then the man hurried and came and told Eli. Now Eli was 98 years old, and his eyes were so set that he could not see. Just a parenthesis there, ladies. This is a visual, a physically visual issue that he was blind, but it was also a picture of his spiritual blindness. And the man said to Eli, "I am he who has come from battle." And he said, "How did it go, my son?" And he brought the news, answering, saying, "Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has also been a great defeat among the people. Your 2 sons also, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured." As soon as he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell over backward from his seat by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died. For the man was old and heavy. He had judged Israel 40 years. Eli was no longer an appropriate leader. He was old, and he was heavy with sin. He was heavy with complacency. He was heavy with just the weight of his desire to placate his evil sons. And so God just said, "No, that's enough." And then to add more pain to the family of Eli, his daughter-in-law, Phinehas' wife, was pregnant at the time and about to give birth when she heard the news that the ark of God was captured and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead. She bowed and gave birth, for her pains came upon her. And about the time of her death, the women attending her said to her, "Do not be afraid, for you have borne a son." But she did not answer or pay attention. And she named the child Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel," because the ark of God had been captured, and because of her father-in-law and her husband. And she said, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured." You know, the glory of God had departed in one sense, in the sense that what this ark represented, yes, it had departed because it was captured by the Philistines. But the glory of God had left a long time ago, much earlier. The glory of God left when Israel stopped repenting and trusting God and started superstitiously trusting in the ark itself. The glory of God actually, this is a quote from Ellison, the glory of God had indeed departed, but not because the ark of God had been captured. The ark had been captured because the glory had already departed. And so God allowed it to be departed, to be captured, because he wasn't in it. He didn't have there was no use for that ark at that time. How could God allow something so terrible to happen? Well, David Guzik says first, he allowed it as a righteous judgment upon Israel as a nation and the family of Eli. They simply received what they deserved. And ladies, just a remark of my own about this. This concerns me greatly that our nation, that once was built on deep, deep faith in God, that our glory has departed. And that the judgment that Israel received is even more deserved now by us. Back to David Guzik, the second thing that he says is why God would allow this to happen is that God allowed it as a correction to the nation so that they would not trust in the ark of God, but instead trust in the God of the ark. Again, can we take heed here? Can we as a nation, as Americans, as individuals, and as a nation, learn from this? Can we be corrected and turn this great ship around? And finally, David Guzik says, though it seemed so terrible to man, was it all that terrible to God? At that moment, did God wring his hands in heaven, worried about how things would turn out, worried about his reputation, worried about the Philistines and their gods? Looking at it this way, the glory had not departed at all. Instead, God was just beginning to show his glory. And we are going to see that in weeks to come as we continue in this series, looking at the hearts of the main characters in the book of 1 Samuel, that we are going to see God's glory on display time after time. We're headed towards that time in the history of Israel, which most often people call the Golden Age, when they are just thriving under the leadership of King David and King Solomon. So can God be manipulated into doing what we want him to do? Can he be mocked or manhandled? And the answer, my dear friends, is no. He cannot. But we need not fret or worry, because he is our sovereign God and he has a plan and he is in control. Thanks for listening, ladies.